Down in Sicily, there was another mobster, deported from America in 1948, who was a made man in Detroit and Sicily, and had a family member that was a powerful member of the Sicilian Catholic Church. His name was Frank Three Fingers Coppola. He's probably the most important mafioso you never heard of.
Now, Coppola is a really interesting character who has a criminal record extending back to his youth in Sicily. He's a bootlegger in Los Angeles. He's a human trafficker in Mexico. He's a labor racketeer in Detroit. He's running drugs out of Cuba. He's all over the place.
And Coppola was also a personal friend of Jimmy Hoffa, president of the Teamsters, America's largest and most powerful union.
A number of congressional committee reports documented the relationship between Coppola and Hoffa and the Teamsters.
Frank Coppola's Detroit heroin receivers were actually set up with their own Teamsters local by Jimmy Hoffa as a cover. Think about that.
One thing that Hoffa could do for the mob was provide political cover. So in the example of Prizziola and Quasarano, Hoffa appoints them as labor representatives in one of the Teamsters local. So we're talking about the origins of the global heroin trade.
So here we have a CIA-protected mafia member sending heroin into America. He has close ties to America's largest trucking union, which has the ability to transport goods to any remote corner of the country at will.
And back in Sicily, he's a political power broker. He has unique connections to Italian senators. The Communist Party is popular in Italy. The labor unions are gaining strength in Italy. And the U.S. State Department has a very real concern that Italy will fall into communist hands.
There were some political strikes called by communist trade union forces and perhaps communist political elements to try to defeat the Marshall Plan, to try to block foreign aid from being unloaded. It became a matter of breaking these strikes. And the U.S. government, through Central Intelligence, and of course, if you want to break a strike, you go to boys who have big bare knuckles and who know how to wield the cudgels.
After World War II, U.S. intelligence would utilize politically connected individuals like Frank Coppola to neutralize leftist political elements within Italy. And in worst case scenarios, actually assassinate or murder union officials, high-ranking members of the Communist Party on behalf of U.S. intelligence agencies.
And they turned to what could best be described as the Corsican Mafia, who became really a paid agent of Central Intelligence.
In about 1953, I terminated funds for Ferry Pisani, and probably he was involved in smuggling heroin going through Marseille, and he didn't need our money.
The Italian elections of 1947 had been good to the Communist Party, and the elections of 1948 were shaping up to be even better. But there was no way that American corporate interests would let Italian workers choose to go communist, as that would threaten the capitalist system at its core. So men like Frank Coppola did the dirty work and reaped the benefits of protection for their criminal pursuits in return. The Italian voters, recently freed from the tyranny of fascism by the Americans, were now to be subjected to the tyranny of democracy by the Americans. Frank Coppola was probably involved in covering up one of the most disturbing acts of political violence in post-war Western Europe. On May 1st, 1947, Sicilian villagers gathered at the village of Portella di Ginestra for the International Labor Day celebration when they were attacked with volleys of gunfire. The culprit was the infamous bandit Salvatore Giuliano, the Robin Hood of Sicily. 11 villagers were left dead, including several young children, and of course, public sentiment turned against Giuliano, and he was hunted by thousands of Italian carabinieri. Journalists and astute observers of the day quickly figured out that right-wing political elements, likely with the prompting and help of the American government, who had actually installed numerous mafiosos as mayors and bureaucrats across Sicily and the mainland, were behind the massacre. By 1950, when the trial of the bandits began, Frank Coppola was back in Sicily, and he was one of the most powerful mafioso there, and his heroin smuggling to Detroit was in full swing. The Sicilian Robin Hood, Giuliano, had been murdered by his right-hand man, Gaspare Pisciata, while he slept. And when Pisciata began threatening to tell who was really behind the massacre, he was poisoned in prison. Over the next 20 years, nearly every bandit and many of the prosecutors and politicians involved with the infamous massacre were themselves murdered. The full truth of the Porta della Ginestra massacre will never be known, but Frank Coppola is suspected by many in the know to have orchestrated the cover-up and murders and the aftermath of the crime itself on behalf of the CIA. To quote Sicilian bandit and murderer Gaspare Pisciata, "We are one body, bandits, police, and mafia, like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit."
Sent a Freedom of Information Act request to CIA for Coppola. They turned me down. It's not their files on Coppola are not declassified.
With the CIA, the American military, and corrupt political forces in Italy providing cover, the heroin business picked up fast after the war. The number of heroin addicts tripled to at least 60,000 by 1952, and at least 150,000 by the time Lucky Luciano died of a heart attack while drinking espresso at the Naples airport in 1962. In the 15 or so years that had passed since World War II ended, heroin had moved from a blip on the criminal radar to becoming one of organized crime's biggest moneymakers. And the 1960s would see it explode into the biggest windfall of profits the underworld had ever seen. More money, more addicts, more corruption.
This, according to the Knapp Commission investigators who filmed it, is a New York City policeman getting paid off, taking bribe money. The patrolman's name is William Phillips. The commission confronted him with the evidence and got him to agree to be an undercover agent. He was also the first witness at this week's public hearings. It wasn't just him, he said, it was everybody.
What percentage of the plainclothesmen assigned to the division, to the 6th Division at that time, do you feel participated in the PAT?
Everyone to my knowledge.
Everyone?
Everyone.
Michael Levine was born and raised in the Bronx, one of the first places hit by the slowly advancing tsunami of illegal drugs coming into America. After joining the military, he became possibly the most successful undercover agent in DEA history.
You already were finding junkies dead. This is the 50s. And nobody really knew where this was going, but they were there, and you knew what junkies were. You knew all about it. You could see them. You could spot them on the street. And they were pretty much, little by little, they were all over the place.
Ground zero for heroin in America was Harlem, New York, and its Black and Puerto Rican residents were the primary victims for America's first drug epidemic.
The only thing that united Italians and Puerto Ricans was the use of drugs.
The traffic starts in Manhattan, more readily obtainable in Manhattan, especially in the Harlem area.
You know, later I went to the hard narcotic smuggling section of customs. That's when I started getting a little bit of an education and understanding that all the heroin was coming from Italian sources. And I got a real up-close view of how that whole scene worked. The French connection into Harlem.
In the American mythology, the 1950s and early 60s are the golden age, the baby boom, new suburbs, low crime. But it was also a time of hidden violence and tremendous corruption.
Federal narcotic agents realize that they're in a position where individually they can make a lot of money off the drug trade, actually control the drug trade itself. As investigators, they can decide who they want to set up. They actually go into business for themselves, selling heroin. And what happened in New York in the 1950s and the 1960s is that the agents started competing with each other to make cases and also to control the trafficking that they were involved with of themselves.
Arrest for unlawful possession of needles and unlawful possession of heroin.
And they were killing each other's informants. There were 28 documented informant murders. They were ripping off drug traffickers. They were trafficking in drugs themselves.
By 1968, the corruption of the FBN, especially the informant murders perpetrated by the narcotics agents themselves, led to congressional hearings, and President Richard Nixon actually disbanded the FBN, replacing it with the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. A truly watershed moment in the war on drugs.
President Nixon today asked Congress to let him set up a single agency in the Justice Department to fight the war on drugs.
To this day, the records from the congressional hearings on FBN informant murders are still sealed by order of the federal government. When the Nazis conquered France, they allowed a large part of southern France to remain semi-independent as a puppet state. Its capital was the spa town of Vichy. The Vichy French had responsibilities to the Nazis, and they set up a Gestapo-like force called the Carlinga. And the Carlinga was full of Corsican gangsters that used their powers to rob and steal from the population. Once the war ended, many of the Carlinga were executed by General Charles de Gaulle's French government, but some of them escaped to South America. One of these Carlinga veterans was a Corsican named Auguste Record. Sentenced to death in absentia by the French court for collaborating with the Nazi regime, he fled across the Atlantic after the war and set himself up as a pimp in Argentina. After getting in legal trouble there, he found a more lucrative business, acting as a broker for French heroin smugglers and American buyers like the Mafia, as well as Cubans and others.
Auguste Record was an escaped Nazi collaborator from France who was part of the rat line that was protected by CIA and relocated in South America. He went to Paraguay, where he pretty much set up an empire.
According to the feds, Auguste Record started sending dope to the States in 1965, and he apparently sent his first 1,300 pounds of heroin without losing a single gram. This was probably no coincidence, the exact same time period when drug consumption was exploding in America. Record's billion-dollar insight was to route the heroin from France into South America first, since the routes from France to the United States were hot.
He may have been the first to be sending both heroin and cocaine in mixed shipments. There was one really big case that I got involved in. It was where heroin and cocaine was smuggled into large amounts of it, was smuggled into the U.S. They called it the picture frame case. They had these very expensive frames and paintings, and inside the frames was mixed shipments of cocaine and heroin. And the smuggler in that case, he was an internationally known chess champion, which all later became part of the Auguste Record indictment, all of this. I got involved in one or two of the really big ones. Record was like a guy sitting back and, moving stuff over 3 continents. An enormous amount of different cases and different players in every different part of the world that evolved into what the prosecutor in New York called the Triangle of Death. The prosecutor had a map of the globe. When he would document a drug shipment or a money transfer, it had different colored pins. And then a homicide, it would call a black pin. So they were linked to so many homicides in part of this conspiracy that the black pins formed a triangle from Europe across South America down into the U.S. Yeah, we brought some of them in from Brazil, and I was assigned to spend a month or two debriefing Claude Pasteur. The French are implicitly trustworthy. They trusted each other in their organization. When you got outside and you dealt with the Italian Mafia, you couldn't trust them.
The so-called French Connection, run by Corsicans like Auguste Record, was one of the most tightly knit, dangerous, and well-run criminal operations of all time. Michael Levine was assigned to guard Richard Bourdin, a member of Record's organization who acted as control, responsible for receiving and delivering huge loads of heroin in the U.S. when Bourdin was arrested, turned informant.
Bourdin, I think, pled guilty to 1,000 kilos of heroin. Bourdin was a guy, he looked like Tom Jones, the singer. He was a very handsome guy, traveled with an entire wardrobe, and he always had 10,000 cash with him. His women, well, just In fact, because when he was working for us, we brought some of his women up to the hotel room. And they were great beauties, you know. That was Berdine. He was still living the high life as an informant. Berdine would be told that drugs were coming in a car, and he was responsible for moving the drugs from the car to the Italian mafia. He would leave the money. He would get the money from the Italians, you know, and he would leave it in a hotel room, and somebody else would pick it up who he didn't know. From the money, he would take to keep his bankroll replenished, so that he's always walking around with at least 10,000. He would take as much, and he would leave a note or whatever he did then that I took X thousands of dollars. I said, well, when would you get paid? He said, oh, they would, you know, it was good. It was like in the bank. He would get an accounting when he got back to France, get everything he wanted, everything he had earned, so to speak.
In New York, U.S. Customs announced today that it has smashed a 5-nation heroin smuggling ring, which it called the largest in American history.
War criminal August Record was arrested in 1970 in Paraguay, where he continued to run his operation with the protection of Paraguay's government for over a year from his jail cell. After being threatened with serious economic sanctions, Paraguay eventually extradited Record to the U.S., but he was sentenced to a mere 20 years in prison for being one of history's biggest drug dealers.
August Record, considered the biggest heroin trafficker ever brought to justice in the United States, today was sentenced to a maximum of 20 years in federal prison. Record, a Frenchman who worked out of Paraguay, was charged in New York with smuggling into the United States a ton of narcotics a year.
August Record only served 10 years in prison. He was released during Ronald Reagan's presidency in 1982, an amazingly short prison term for the man that helped fuel the great American heroin epidemic. Perhaps it was his reward for keeping quiet about the American government's role in the international drug trade.
We've turned the corner on drug addiction in the United States. Drug addiction in the United States is under control.
As far as I hear, in schools they're selling drugs for $1.
Many people in the inner cities used the flood of heroin on American streets to find temporary solace from the pains of life, and many soldiers began using hard drugs in Vietnam as a way to cope with the horrors of
who have become completely disillusioned with our society.
You didn't say nothing about that little infraction when I was over there fighting and killing people. The majority of my friends from Brownsville, Harlem, and Memphis died. Some of them don't have no motherfucking waist from down to up. Some of them can't see. Some of them are just shell-shocked. You dig it? I was lucky. I got a Chinese-made rifle bullet in my motherfucking foot. It make me feel like I want to kill every motherfucker who made me go over there. Every motherfucker who said I had to go. That goes from the motherfucker who put the stamp on the letter who sent me the token to the motherfucking bus that took me to Fort Dix. Every single one of them motherfuckers. That's how I make it.
And now we come back to the beginning of our story. The Vietnam War, how it created America's first great drug epidemic. Many of the new wave of American heroin addicts had gotten addicted in the Vietnam War. After all, war is hell. What better relief than a needle in your arm?
In New York City, there are 300,000 Vietnam-era veterans, and 40,000 of them are addicts. Most of them began using heroin, barbiturates, and amphetamines in Vietnam.
Every man leaving South Vietnam now is tested for heroin addiction.
These GIs have completed their Vietnam tours and are getting ready to go home. But before they can leave here, they'll have to submit urine samples.
A congressional report has estimated that 10 to 15% of American servicemen in Indochina are heroin addicts.
To understand how the Vietnam War became the ultimate nexus of addiction corruption in Cold War politics, let's go back once again to the end of World War II and meet our old friends Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang anti-communist army.
Chiang Kai-shek reviews the armed forces of nationalist China on his island stronghold Formosa. Fighting units of the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps are lined up for the Generalissimo's annual Grand Review. Jeeps bring visiting military and naval dignitaries invited to lunch. America's Vice Admiral Pride, commander of the 7th Fleet guarding Formosa, is among them.
As we get into the early 50s and really settle into the Cold War, the U.S. government feels that the weak point in the Southeast Asian defense against communist China is Burma. So the U.S. begins arming the anti-communist Chinese KMT army remnants in the so-called Shan State, which is a very mountainous, heavily jungled area, very remote and cut off from the rest of the world that sits between the borders of China, Burma, Laos, and Thailand. The Shan State was also one of the largest opium growing regions in the world. So how did the former French colonies in Southeast Asia become the heroin production center of the world? Thank the British. During the 17 and 1800s, the British began selling massive quantities of Indian opium to China and the rest of Southeast Asia. Millions of addicts were created. Tens of thousands of opium dens existed in China, Burma, Thailand, and Vietnam. British made so much money off the opium trade that when the Chinese emperor began cutting off the heads of anyone selling the drug and attempted to arrest British officials involved in the trade, Britain sent out gunboats and troops and attacked China in 2 separate opium wars, forcing the Chinese royal court to allow the drug to be sold to their subjects.
Although she would be censured in the eyes of the world, the war enabled Britain to force a treaty, giving her the greatest port in the Far East, Hong Kong.
These are really the first drug wars, despite what you might have seen on the nightly news. Growing opium and smoking it spread south from China throughout the region, and even as World War II approached, the French colonial government's tax on opium still accounted for 15% of their total government revenue. After Japan surrendered to the Allies in 1945, communists took power in China. The American government backed the remnants of the anti-communists led by General Chiang Kai-shek. Communists quickly shut down opium and heroin production in China and brutally cracked down on organized crime, causing the entire Shanghai criminal underworld to relocate to the British colony of Hong Kong, taking their opium contacts and heroin production expertise with them. In 1950, the CIA purchased a bankrupt airline, used the fleet of planes to run weapons to the KMT in Shan province. The planes would return to Bangkok filled with opium. This operation became known as Air America. The KMT's main opium customer in Bangkok was a man named General Phao. Phao was the commander of the Thai National Police Force. He was also the CIA's man in Thailand. From Bangkok, the Thai National Police themselves often loaded raw opium onto boats, and from there it was escorted by the maritime police to rendezvous with large freighters bound for Singapore or Hong Kong to be processed into finished heroin and sent to the United States, usually via smuggling rings controlled by the same Corsican gangsters that were helped fighting the Viet Minh communists in Indochina. The volume of the CIA-facilitated Thai heroin industry was gigantic. In 1957, a Thai military leader named Sarit Thanarat seized control of the country in a CIA-backed coup. His cousin was the staunchly anti-communist king of Laos. When Field Marshal Sarit died in 1963, he'd amassed over $150 million, making him more than a billionaire in today's money. Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT went on to found the new nation of Taiwan, which could be considered the world's first narco-state. The Kuomintang ruled Taiwan with an iron fist up through the 1980s, even killing anyone that dared speak against our ally Chiang Kai-shek. For the last 60 years, Taiwan has been one of the fastest growing economies in the world, with close trade ties to the United States, and today it's one of Asia's wealthiest countries.
Last year's Geneva Conference ended the war in Indochina, but it has not yet brought internal peace to that unhappy land.
While America's Chinese allies were turning themselves into the world's biggest drug manufacturers, revolution was brewing in the old French colony of Indochina. A radical student leader educated in Paris, a man named Ho Chi Minh, was leading the revolt against French rule.